Fire. It is nature's great eraser, a force of terrifying, indiscriminate purification. It can cleanse a forest to allow new growth, and it can reduce a lifetime of memories to a pile of ash and smoke. But what if the fire is not an accident? What if the inferno is not the tragedy itself, but a curtain, a blistering shroud designed to hide a much colder, more calculated crime? Tonight, we journey to the scene of a catastrophe, a magnificent mansion, a pillar of wealth and power, engulfed in a midnight blaze. The man inside, a titan of industry, is believed to be a victim of a tragic accident. But as firefighters sift through the smoking ruins, detectives begin to uncover the embers of a different story, a story of secrets, betrayal, and a murderous plot hidden behind a wall of flames. Before we step into the ash garden and begin to piece together this scorched puzzle, please do us a favor and hit that subscribe button, and make sure you ring the notification bell. We dig deep into the most complex cases every week, and you won't want to miss a single clue. Now, take a deep breath as we investigate the fire that consumed Falcon's Ridge and the chilling truth it was meant to conceal. The flames that devoured Falcon's Ridge could be seen from 20 miles away. It was not a fire. It was a hungry, living entity, a roaring beast of orange and crimson that clawed at the midnight sky, turning the serene, star-dusted darkness into a flickering, apocalyptic dawn. The mansion, a sprawling masterpiece of modern architecture perched atop the highest point in the affluent enclave of Sterling Canyon, was being consumed, its clean lines and vast glass walls surrendering to the inferno's insatiable appetite. By the time the first engine from the Sterling Canyon Fire Department arrived, its sirens a helpless wail against the roar of the blaze, the west wing was already a skeleton, and the main atrium was a cauldron of molten glass and collapsing steel. Fire Captain Eva Rostova knew from the moment she saw it that this was no ordinary house fire. The intensity, the speed, the sheer violence of it spoke a language she was fluent in. This was a fire with a purpose. It was a fire that had been fed. For 3 hours, her teams battled the blaze, a heroic but ultimately futile effort to save the unsalvageable. The structure groaned and hissed, surrendering piece by agonizing piece until, with a final, deafening roar, the main roof collapsed inward, sending a volcano of sparks and embers into the night. What was left was a smoking, blackened husk, a skeletal ruin silhouetted against the coming dawn, its gardens and pristine lawns now a blanket of gray, spectral ash. The call had come in from a panicked neighbor, but everyone knew who the house belonged to. This was the home of Marcus Thorne, a real estate tycoon whose name was a synonym for ruthless ambition, a man who built empires and crushed his rivals with the same cold, architectural precision he had used to build his fortress on the hill. He was a man of immense wealth and, consequently, immense enmities. It was during the final cooling-down phase, as firefighters picked their way through the treacherous, steaming debris, that the call went out to the police. A body had been found. In what was once the grand, 2-story library on the ground floor, a team had discovered the remains of a single victim, presumed to be Marcus Thorne himself. He was found near the skeletal frame of his massive oak desk. The initial report was simple: a tragic accident, a faulty wire, a fallen candle, a spark from the fireplace. In a house of that size, the possibilities were endless. A man, likely asleep, trapped in his own burning monument. That was the official narrative for precisely 45 minutes, until the arrival of Detective Miles Harding and Detective Grace Chin. Harding was a homicide detective of the old school, a man whose rumpled suit and perennially tired eyes belied a mind that was as sharp and cynical as a shard of broken glass. He believed that the more money a person had, the more creative their reasons for wanting each other dead became. Chun was his younger, sharper-edged partner. Where Harding saw human nature, Chun saw data. She understood that, in the modern world, every secret, every lie, left a digital breadcrumb trail, and she was an expert at following it. They were met by Captain Rostova, her face smudged with soot, her eyes weary but alert. "It's a bad one, detectives," she said, her voice raspy from the smoke. "The whole place is a loss. We found Mr. Thorne in the library. Looks like the fire started in there. Accident." Harding asked, his gaze already sweeping over the smoldering ruin, his nose wrinkling at the acrid smell of burnt plastic and wet ash. Rostova's expression tightened. My gut says no. The burn patterns are wrong. It moved too fast, too hot. My team found traces of what smells like a chemical accelerant near the desk and by the main doorway. We'll know for sure when the lab results come back, but I'd bet my pension this was arson. The word arson changed everything. The case instantly transformed from a tragic accident to a homicide investigation. The body was no longer a victim of the fire. The fire was the accomplice to his murder. As the medical examiner, Dr. Evans, a man of quiet, morbid professionalism, began his preliminary examination of the charred remains, Harding and Chan started to piece together the victim's last hours. They were met at the property line, which was now swarming with press, by two key figures in Marcus Thorne's life: his wife and his son. Isabella Thorne was in her late 20s, a woman of breathtaking beauty, even with her face pale and tear-streaked. She was Marcus's third wife, a former art gallery curator he had married less than 2 years ago. She was wrapped in a blanket, shivering, her eyes wide with shock. I was at my sister's place in the city, she explained, her voice a fragile whisper. We had a girls' night. Marcus and we'd had a small argument. I thought it was best to give him some space. I got the call an hour ago. Julian Thorne, Marcus's son from his first marriage, stood a few feet away, a storm cloud of sullen anger. He was in his early 30s, with his father's handsome features but none of his polish. His clothes were expensive but rumpled, and he smelled faintly of alcohol and resentment. I haven't spoken to him in a week, Julian spat, his eyes fixed on the smoldering house. He cut me off, changed the locks on the gate. The old bastard finally did it. His alibi was a hazy tour of several downtown bars, a story that would be a nightmare to verify. The dynamic was classic, a tableau Harding had seen 100 times. The beautiful, much younger wife who stood to inherit a fortune, and the disinherited, angry son who felt cheated of his birthright. They were the two most obvious suspects, standing together in a strained, awkward silence, their grief, if any, overshadowed by the raw, uncertain reality of their new circumstances. Back inside the ruin, Dr. Evans called the detectives over. He had managed to clear away enough debris to get a better look at the body. This is interesting, he said, his voice a low murmur. Given the intensity of the blaze, I would have expected severe thermal damage to the entire body. But his back, the part that was pressed against the leather of the chair, is relatively intact. He pointed with a gloved finger. And look here, the smoke. There should be soot lining his trachea in his lungs. That's the telltale sign of death by smoke inhalation. The victim breathes in the fire. And, Harding prompted, his gut instinct from hours earlier now screaming at him. There's no soot, Dr. Evans said, looking up at them, his eyes grim behind his glasses. None at all. My preliminary assessment, pending a full autopsy, is that Marcus Thorne was dead before the first flame ever touched him. The air suddenly felt colder, despite the still simmering heat from the wreckage. This was not a fire set to kill a man. This was a fire set to hide a murder. The killer hadn't just wanted Marcus Thorne dead. They had wanted him erased, his secrets and the evidence of his murder incinerated and reduced to anonymous ash. Chen's mind was already racing. The security system, she said, turning to the fire captain. Was there a main panel? Anything that might have survived? The house was a fortress, Rostova confirmed. Top of the line system. The main server was in a reinforced utility room in the basement. It's probably cooked, but it might have a heat-shielded hard drive. We'll know when we can get down there. The rest of the morning was a slow, painstaking process of sifting through what was now being called the Ash Garden. The arson investigation team moved in, their chemical-sniffing dogs confirming Rostova's initial assessment. They found multiple points of origin, a clear sign of a deliberately set fire. The accelerant was a sophisticated blend of chemicals, something that burned hot and fast, designed to maximize destruction. The murder weapon was nowhere to be found. The chaos of the scene made it almost impossible to tell what had been there before the fire and what hadn't. Later that afternoon, the full autopsy report came in, and it delivered the final, shocking piece of the puzzle. Dr. Evans had confirmed the cause of death. Marcus Thorne had been killed by a single, powerful blow to the back of his head with a heavy, blunt object. The force of the impact had been significant, causing a massive skull fracture and instantaneous death. The killer had likely come up behind him while he sat at his desk. It was an ambush, an execution. So, Harding said, standing with Chun on the overlook, the setting sun casting long, dark shadows across the ruined estate. Our killer is someone who knew the layout of the house. Someone who could get close to Thorne without raising an alarm. Someone who knew how to start a very professional fire to cover their tracks. And someone who had a very good reason to cave in the back of his head. The wife, the son, Chun listed, ticking them off on her fingers. Both have motive. Isabella inherits a billion-dollar estate. Julian gets his revenge and, depending on the will, his inheritance back. We need to look at Thorne's business rivals, too. A man like that collects enemies like other people collect stamps. The investigation was just beginning, but the parameters were clear. They were hunting for a killer who was not just brutal, but also cunning and meticulous. A killer who had used the raw, untamable power of fire as their accomplice. As they looked at the blackened shell of Falcon's Ridge, they knew the truth was buried somewhere in those ashes, and in the scorched secrets of the powerful and deeply dysfunctional Thorne family. In the days following the fire, the shell of Falcon's Ridge became a place of pilgrimage for the curious and a complex, multi-layered crime scene for the investigators. The once majestic mansion was now a skeleton picked clean by the flames, its silence broken only by the whisper of the wind through its empty window frames and the methodical crunch of investigators' boots on the blanket of ash and debris. For detectives Harding and Chen, the real work had begun. The painstaking process of reconstructing a man's life in order to understand his death. They knew the fire was a mask, and their job was to peel it back, layer by agonizing layer. Their first priority was to dismantle the alibis of their two primary suspects. Julian Thorne's claim of a drunken night on the town proved to be as hazy as he had described. He had been seen at 3 different high-end bars, but no one could definitively say when he had arrived or when he had left. He had paid in cash, a deliberate move to avoid a digital trail. He was a ghost for a crucial 3-hour window between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., the exact window during which the ME placed the time of death and the fire had been started. When pressed, Julian became belligerent. "So I was drunk, so what?" He'd snarled at Harding in a second interview. "It's what I do. You think I was sober enough to mastermind some kind of arson plot? I hated the bastard, yes. I would have gladly punched him in the face. But this is something else." His denial was passionate, but it was the denial of a cornered man, not necessarily an innocent one. Isabella Thorne's alibi was, on the surface, much stronger. Her sister, a quiet, nervous woman named Sophia, confirmed that Isabella had been with her all night. They had watched movies, drank wine, and Isabella had fallen asleep on the couch. But when Chun dug a little deeper, she found a crack. Sophia's apartment building had a security camera in the lobby. The footage showed Isabella arriving at 9 p.m., as she'd claimed. It did not, however, show her leaving. But the camera had a blind spot near a rear service exit that led to a back alley. Furthermore, a check of Isabella's car's GPS, which she had apparently forgotten about, showed the vehicle had left her sister's neighborhood at 11:30 p.m. and had returned at 1:45 a.m. The trip history had been deleted, but the car's internal logs, which Chun had a warrant for, had recorded the ghost trip. When confronted with this, Isabella's composure finally broke. "I couldn't sleep," she'd wept, her story now changing. "I was so upset about the fight with Marcus. I just went for a drive. To clear my head. I drove for a while, I parked, I cried. I didn't want my sister to know how upset I was. I was ashamed." It was a plausible story, born of emotional distress, but it also placed her away from her alibi during the exact time of the murder. While the alibis were being eroded, Chun was having more luck with the digital evidence recovered from the scene. The hard drive from the mansion's security server was, as hoped, partially shielded by its casing. It was a mess, but Chen's contacts in the FBI's digital forensics lab were able to recover fragments of data. The most crucial fragment was the system's access log. It showed that the entire security system, the cameras, the motion sensors, the alarm had been manually disabled at 11:58 p.m. on the night of the murder. It had not been cut or shorted out. It had been logged into with a master-level administrative password and shut down cleanly. This was not the work of a stranger. It was the work of someone who had the keys to the kingdom. Only 2 people had that level of access. Chun told Harding, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of discovery. Marcus Thorne himself, and his wife Isabella. The investigation began to pivot, the weight of suspicion shifting heavily onto the grieving widow. Harding decided it was time to learn more about the state of the Thorne marriage. He paid a visit to the family's long-serving housekeeper, a stern, tightly wound woman named Mrs. Gable, who had been given the night off on the evening of the fire. At first, Mrs. Gable was a fortress of loyalty, speaking of Mr. Thorne in reverent tones. But under Harding's patient, empathetic questioning, the fortress began to crumble, revealing the ugly truth of the house's inner life. "He was a difficult man, detective," she finally admitted, her hands twisting a handkerchief in her lap. "Powerful men often are. But towards the end he was cruel, especially to her. Her was Isabella. He treated her not like a wife, but like another one of his acquisitions. A beautiful painting to be hung on the wall and admired, but not to be touched or to have an opinion of its own. He controlled her money, her friends, her time. She was a prisoner in that beautiful house. Did she seem afraid of him?" Harding asked. "Lately, yes," Mrs. Gable said, her voice dropping. "There was an argument about 2 weeks ago, the worst I'd ever heard. It was about the will. He was changing it. I heard him yelling at her, 'You will get what you are owed, and not a penny more.' This was a bombshell. A changed will could completely alter the motive." Harding immediately had the family's lawyer, a man with a perpetually nervous disposition, subpoenaed. The lawyer confirmed it. Marcus Thorne had indeed been in the process of changing his will. The new version disinherited his son, Julian, completely, but it also drastically altered Isabella's inheritance. Instead of inheriting the bulk of his liquid assets and properties, the new will placed almost the entire estate into a tightly controlled trust, managed by a board of his business associates. Isabella would receive a generous, but for a billionaire's wife, modest annual stipend. She would go from being the potential queen of an empire to a well-compensated employee. The one person who stood to gain from Marcus's death was now the person who stood to lose the most if he had lived long enough to sign the new documents. And he had been scheduled to do just that the day after he was murdered. The motive was now crystal clear. Isabella had to act before that pen hit the paper. But how had she done it? A woman of her slight build overpowering a man like Marcus Thorne, and then setting a sophisticated multi-point fire? It seemed unlikely she had acted alone. The answer came, as it so often did, from the digital world. While reviewing the fragments of data from Marcus's computer, Chun had found something odd. It was the remnants of a recurring, encrypted calendar appointment. Labeled only Meeting RS, it occurred every Tuesday afternoon. On a hunch, Chun dug into Isabella's life, specifically her social circle. She found a close friend, another socialite, who had recently gone through a messy divorce. The divorce lawyer she had used was one of the best, a man named Richard Sterling. Harding's ears pricked up at the name. Richard Sterling was not a divorce lawyer. He was the ruthless CEO of Sterling Enterprises, Marcus Thorne's biggest and most bitter business rival. The man Thorne had recently driven to the brink of bankruptcy in a hostile takeover. "It wasn't a divorce lawyer," Chun said, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "She was meeting with the rival. RS isn't a lawyer. It's Richard Sterling." Suddenly, a new, more terrifying picture began to form. This wasn't just a domestic dispute. This was a conspiracy. Harding and Chun paid a visit to Richard Sterling, a man whose polished, predatory smile didn't quite hide the look of a cornered animal in his eyes. He denied everything, of course. His alibi for the night of the murder was ironclad. He was at a high-profile political fundraiser, seen by hundreds of people. "Yes, I met with Isabella Thorne a few times," he admitted, his voice smooth as silk. "She was a concerned shareholder, worried about the reckless direction Marcus was taking the company. Our conversations were purely about business." But Chun had already pulled the cell tower data. On the night of the murder, during a 30-minute period where Sterling had stepped out to take a private call at the fundraiser, his phone had pinged a tower that serviced a dead zone halfway between the city and Sterling Canyon. And a second phone, a disposable burner phone, had pinged that same tower at the same time. That burner phone's last known location, before being shut off permanently, was less than a mile from Falcon's Ridge. The final piece came from the house itself. In the library, forensics had found a single, high-end cigar but in the ashes near the fireplace, a brand that Marcus Thorne was known not to smoke. It was, however, Richard Sterling's signature brand. He had been there. He had met with Marcus. "This is what happened," Harding said, pacing in front of the whiteboard back at the precinct, the entire board now a spiderweb of connections. Isabella knew she was about to be cut out of the will. She was desperate. She went to her husband's biggest rival, Sterling. She offered him the ultimate prize: insider information to destroy Thorne's company from within, in exchange for his help in getting rid of her husband. And maybe a cut of the inheritance she thought she'd get. "Sterling had the motive and the means," Chun continued. "He couldn't be there himself, so he hired a professional. Someone to get in, kill Thorne, and set the fire. Isabella's role was to be the inside woman. She used her password to disable the security system, letting the killer in. She provided the layout, the timing. Her drive to clear her head wasn't a drive at all. It was her dropping off the killer and then waiting at a safe distance to pick him up. The son, Julian, they realized, was a complete red herring. His hatred for his father was real, but he was just a pawn, a convenient distraction whose obvious motive had perfectly clouded the real, far more sophisticated plot. They had uncovered the conspiracy. They had the motive, the means, and the digital and physical evidence to connect the beautiful, desperate wife and the ruthless business rival. It was a plot born of mutual desperation, a perfect storm of greed and revenge. They were no longer just hunting a killer. They were dismantling an alliance forged in the darkest corners of the city's elite. The House of Whispers had finally given up its secrets, and the voices were screaming murder. The endgame began not with a bang, but with the quiet, coordinated execution of 2 search warrants and 2 arrests. At precisely 6 a.m., as the city was still shrouded in a pre-dawn gloom, 2 separate tactical teams moved in. Detective Harding led the team that breached the stately doors of Richard Sterling's penthouse apartment. Detective Chun was with the unit that served the warrant at the home of Isabella Thorne's sister, where Isabella had been staying since the fire. The arrests were made swiftly, professionally, and without incident. The Queen and her allied king had been taken from the board. The true battle, however, would be fought in the interrogation rooms of the precinct, 2 sterile, soundproofed boxes where the powerful facades of the city's elite would be stripped away under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. The strategy was classic and brutally effective. Separate and conquer. Harding and Chun knew that an alliance forged in greed was only as strong as the self-interest of its members. Harding sat opposite Richard Sterling. The tycoon, now dressed in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, had lost his predatory gleam. He looked smaller, his expensive suit replaced by cheap cotton, his power nullified. He was flanked by a high-priced lawyer who immediately advised his client to say nothing. "We found the burner phone, Richard," Harding began, his voice a low, conversational rumble. "The one you used to coordinate with your hired help. We found the offshore account you used to pay him. We know you met with Marcus on the night of the fire. You left your cigar behind." Sloppy. Sterling remained silent, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall just past Harding's head. But Harding could see the flicker of fear in his eyes. The cigar was an unexpected blow. In the adjacent room, Chun was taking a different approach with Isabella. She didn't lead with aggression. She led with a manufactured sympathy. "He's going to betray you, Isabella," she said softly, her voice calm and reasonable. "Men like Richard Sterling, men like your husband, they don't have partners. They have assets. And when an asset becomes a liability, they cut it loose. Right now, in the room next door, his lawyer is probably negotiating a deal that will paint you as the manipulative, murderous Black Widow and him as the unwitting businessman who was seduced and trapped by your scheme. He will walk away with a lesser charge, and you will spend the rest of your life in prison." Isabella, who had maintained a fragile but defiant composure, began to crumble. The fear of betrayal was a far more potent weapon than the fear of the law. "That's not true," she whispered, her eyes darting towards the wall, as if she could hear the conversation next door. "We were partners. We had an agreement." "There are no agreements with snakes," Chen said, her voice turning hard. "We have the proof, Isabella. We know you shut down the security system. We know you lured Marcus to the library, telling him you wanted to talk. We know you let the killer in. The only question left is who is going to tell us the truth first. Him or you?" The pressure mounted for 2 hours. Harding laid out the financial evidence against Sterling, the intricate web of offshore accounts that proved he had paid a known ex-military contractor, a man who had since vanished, a sum of $200,000 the day after the fire. Sterling's lawyer blustered and objected, but the evidence was overwhelming. Meanwhile, Chun chipped away at Isabella's resolve, showing her the GPS data from her car, the cell tower pings from the burner phone, explaining how easily they could prove she had coordinated the killer's movements. The break came, as they had predicted, from Isabella. Her fear of being Sterling's scapegoat finally outweighed her fear of confessing. The dam of lies burst, and the full, ugly truth came flooding out in a torrent of sobs and self-justification. "Marcus was a monster," she began, her voice thick with a mixture of hatred and fear. "He was going to destroy me. He found out about my friendship with Richard. He saw it as the ultimate betrayal, not because he loved me, but because his property was consorting with the enemy. He told me he was going to sign the new will and then file for divorce on grounds of adultery, leaving me with nothing but public humiliation. He was going to ruin Julian, have him prosecuted for embezzlement to punish me further. He was going to burn my whole world to the ground." Her friendship with Sterling had started as a business alliance. She had been feeding him insider information about Thorne's company for months, both for money and for a petty sense of revenge. When Marcus had discovered it and threatened her, the alliance had escalated into a murderous conspiracy. "It was Richard's idea," she insisted. "He said it was the only way. A clean slate. He said he knew a man who could handle it, who could make it look like an accident. All I had to do was get Marcus alone and shut down the system. I was supposed to be at my sister's, to have a perfect alibi." She described the night of the murder with a chilling, detached horror. She had called Marcus, telling him she wanted to come home and apologize, to talk things through. He, arrogant and confident in his victory, had agreed. She had arrived at 11:45 p.m., used her code to disable the security, and let the hired killer in through a side garden door. "I didn't see it happen," she wept, her hands covering her face. "I just waited in the foyer. I heard them arguing. Marcus was shouting. Then, there was a sound. Terrible, heavy sound. And then silence. The man, the killer, he came out a few minutes later. He just looked at me and said, 'It's done. Get out of here. This place will be gone in an hour.' And I ran. I just ran." Faced with Isabella's detailed, signed confession, Richard Sterling's wall of silence collapsed. His lawyer, seeing the inevitable, negotiated a plea deal. Sterling confessed to his role in planning and financing the murder in exchange for taking the death penalty off the table. He admitted to everything, his confession a cold, pragmatic business assessment of a risk that hadn't paid off. The hitman he had hired was a ghost, likely already out of the country and disappeared into a new identity. The case was closed. The headlines were sensational, a lurid tale of sex, money, betrayal, and murder among the city's wealthiest citizens. Isabella Thorne and Richard Sterling were both sentenced to life in prison, their illicit partnership ending in a shared, desolate future behind bars. Julian Thorne, a tragic pawn in a game he never fully understood, was spared prosecution for his financial misdeeds, left to grapple with the horrifying truth of his father's murder and his own unwitting role as a distraction. Months later, Detectives Harding and Chun stood once again on the overlook, gazing down at the now empty lot where Falcon's Ridge had once stood. The debris had been cleared, leaving only a scarred, black foundation, an architectural ghost on the hill. The land was now entangled in a web of legal battles, its immense value tainted by the blood that had been spilled there. They had everything, Harding said, shaking his head. Money, power, beauty. And they burned it all to the ground, literally and figuratively. For what? A little more money? A little more power? It wasn't about more, Chin replied, her gaze distant. It was about not losing. Marcus was going to make them lose, so they changed the game. They just didn't realize the price of winning would be everything they had. The wind picked up, carrying the faint, lingering scent of cold ash from the empty lot. The fire had been extinguished. The killers were behind bars, but the ghosts of Falcon's Ridge would haunt the city for a long time. It was a stark, smoking reminder that even the most magnificent houses can be built on foundations of lies, and that some secrets, no matter how well hidden, will eventually find their way out of the ashes.